if these lies are encouraging people to act as if they don't need to produce before they consume, as if they don't need to pay back their debt, as if they basically, Sacha touched on this too, that essentially can just lie themselves and there are no consequences because we've artificially deferred the consequences. When you feed that back into point number one, that will influence how everybody else behaves on a long enough time horizon, because culture is necessarily self-referential. If you can get away with lying, you deteriorate the collective ability of basically everybody else to stop you from lying. And one by one, they'll all start lying instead. So that's, Bitcoin fixes this. Hooray.
Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on the show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor based. So all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer. Today's podcast is brought to you by In Wolf's Clothing. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times per year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that help fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. So go to wolfnyc.com to learn more about the program or apply. Again, that's WolfNYC, WOLFNYC.com.
All right, so we just wrapped up talking about Chapter 7. A lot of interesting stuff there about data monopolies and the nature of these new economic entities or semi-new economic entities. Now we're going to go into Chapter 8, which you guys titled These Were Capitalist. Subtitle is Social, Urban, and Cultural Capital, their communitarian essence, and their unlikely champions. And I thought I just really like the opening. There's a long opening excerpt here in the chapter I think is really good. It gets back to our early discussion about the nature of capital, but I think it's additive in a way. It kind of hits on some things that we didn't maybe touch on directly, or maybe reiterate some of what we talked about as well. But you guys wrote, quote, following Hernando de Soto, we see capital as economic potential energy, a stock of crystallized and stored time, the memory of experimentation and discovery, a tool allowing us to not need to work completely from scratch, and shared in a common language to spare us equally from isolation. Beautiful fucking definition, by the way. As De Soto explains in The Mystery of Capital, and now you guys are quoting De Soto, to unravel the mystery of capital, we have to go back to the seminal meaning of the word. In medieval Latin, capital appears to have denoted head of cattle or other livestock, which have always been important sources of wealth beyond the basic meat they provide. Livestock are low-maintenance possessions. They are mobile and can be moved away from danger. They are also easy to count and measure. But most important, from livestock, you can obtain additional wealth or surplus value by setting in motion other industries, including milk, hides, wool, meat, and fuel. Livestock also have the useful attribute of being able to reproduce themselves. Thus, the term capital begins to do two jobs simultaneously, capturing the physical dimension of assets, livestock, as well as their potential to generate surplus value. From the barnyard, it was only a short step to the desk of the inventors of economics, who generally defined capital as that part of a country's assets that initiates surplus production and increases productivity. End of DeSoto's quote. Back to what you guys wrote. Capital is whatever can be transformed or used to produce goods that satisfy human wants. It can be stored, deployed, and accumulated because it is productive. But as discussed in Chapter 4, Wittgenstein's Money, it follows also that capital is, like value, entirely subjective. We call capital that which we use in the process of creating a good. Milk may be the good, which will satisfy our want for a beverage, but it can also be the capital, which we can use to produce a cake, which will satisfy our hunger. Capital is thus an abstract idea we superimpose on reality to describe things which have subjectively useful potential energy. Unquote. Just a absolute fire introduction to the chapter. And the reference to cattle and livestock, I think there's a connection to money here too, because the word pecuniary, which means related to money, is derived from the Latin word pecu or pecune, which meant cattle or money. So there's an interesting etymological connection there. And then I just wonder if you guys could expand a bit on the origin of this term and its unavoidably subjective nature. I don't know that we touched on this too much previously, that we've been discussing capital as though it's all these different things. You know, it can be scarce, non-scarce, it can be knowledge, it can be goods or tools, as you quoted in your essay, that capital is tools. It's kind of like one of the most simplistic, reductive ways to describe it, but it's very subjective. And we touched on this. I think I mentioned this earlier. I don't know if it was this episode or before, but like oil, right? Mm-hmm. If you had land and you had oil on it before the industrial age, that was not capital, right? It was a nuisance. You had to get the oil. You had to pay people to come and get the oil off the land so you could grow crops. Fast forward to the industrial age, you have one of the most important forms of capital in the world on your land, right? It's, you know, people fight wars over it now. It's one of the most precious forms of capital in the world. So just by the nature of our technological paradigm changing, the subjective capital value we ascribe to oil changed as well. It went from non-capital to capital. So I wonder if you guys could just maybe tap into that a little bit and expand on the subjective nature of capital.
Well, I think the oil example is really good in that it tells us how the same thing can, depending on the situation, be either seen as an asset or capital as an asset or a liability. An asset because you can now use this within the context of what you know to create value. A liability because you do not have in the prior example, before Industrial Revolution, you simply don't know what to use this for, or what use there is limited, and therefore it's not as valuable as whatever else you want to be doing. And another one, sometimes I think about this when I am on a cycle path that used to be a trail, a railway line, and it's been reconverted, and now it's a nice urban little cycle. Nice little infrastructure people can go around and things like that. There's tons of value in this, but no one really thought about that being like a green little corridor through a city being valuable when they were building railways at the time. Like it's now really cool that it offers a respite from the hustle and bustle of the city. People also use it for transportation. So it's clearly capital. It's still super useful. It's transportation, it's entertainment. But before that, it was a completely different use.
Mm-hmm.
Same can be said for canals. People now row on canals over the weekend, and it's like a hobby. But before that, it was heavy duty industrial usage. So there are tons of ways in which the same thing can be seen differently over time. And in both of those cases I've given with the canal and the railway, they're both assets. They're just used differently. So that's one thing. Another one is an asset, which is a liability in a different environment. That's what you were talking about with oil.
Yeah. I think I maybe just generalize it a bit as well, because there's another really obvious example of historical importance, I guess, or importance to the historical development of economics, which is the, I'm going to say the so-called water diamond paradox. I don't think it's a paradox. I think it's just slightly confusing if you're not thinking about it properly. But the idea that in almost any context, diamonds are going to be valued many orders of magnitude more so than some seemingly equivalent amount of water, for a whole bunch of reasons, or a whole bunch of physical reasons, let's say, as opposed to just like, oh, value is subjective. However, if you are dying in the desert, there's no amount of diamonds that you will value at all, whereas you'll value any minuscule amount of water nearly infinitely. And so this is, again, it's not really a paradox at all, because the answer is not just subjective value, actually, but maybe more specifically marginal value. So this is effectively, when I say it's of importance to the historical development of economics, this is basically solved by the marginal revolution. This is the context in which it was invoked then as well. But when understood that way, it's clearly not paradoxical when you appreciate marginalism on top of subjective value. And I think just extending it a little bit to tie in with your question, Robert, that there's no reason to stop just at goods, because if anything, capital that produces goods introduces yet another layer of subjective uncertainty, which is it's not just the subjectivity of the exact situation in which you may or may not value something, or value one thing more than another, and yet that would change if the circumstances were different. It is that, but another step removed, because you're also guessing what other people will value implicitly, because obviously the whole point of ascribing something as capital is that you're not going to consume it, you're going to use it to create something that somebody will consume.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I appreciate you bringing up the water diamond paradox, quote unquote paradox, because that's what catalyzed, I think, as you just said, that the marginalism revolution in economics, right? That value is subjective. We value things at the margin, right? It's not water as a whole, diamonds as a whole. It's like the next unit of the thing. Where do we put that in our scale evaluation? And that too is the fundamental schism between Keynesian economics and real economics, right? That Keynesian economics treats these things as it views value as something more objective, I guess, whereas Austrian economics treats it subjectively. And the other thing that invokes for me is it gets into Peterson puts this well. He says that the world, this is like in the opening of his book, Maps of Meaning, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's not what he actually says, but you can conceive of the world as made of matter, or you can conceive the world as made of what matters. So it's this realm of like relevance, right? How is it relevant to human action? How is it useful?
It's a good line.
Yeah, it's about human purpose and the value we ascribe to different things, but that obviously changes over time as technology changes, as knowledge changes, really, right? As the stock of knowledge changes, you might say, something like that. And this gets into culture, I think, which is just kind of the thrust of this chapter 8, is we're talking about or you guys are writing about the relationship between capital and culture. And culture seems to be more of that side of the universe of what matters rather than matter itself, yet somehow they interact, which is very interesting.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that Keynesian economics assumes that there's such a thing as objective value, but to quote I
may have misquoted that. So pre-marginalism, they used to talk about utils, right? These elementary particles of value.
I mean, definitely there's a couple of things you could mention. So
I was just so before so classical economics definitely it's all about the labor cost theory. What is it called again?
The theory of value.
Well, the marginal revolution itself was largely a reaction to Marx, which is hardcore labor theory of value. Which Adam Smith had kind of implicitly, but without drawing too much attention to it. Ricardo kind of picked this up, but also introduced a bit of also implicitly an element of cost theory of value. And I think cost theory of value is more, it's getting closer to the point, and I think to a lot of people it seems more intuitively plausible. But then obviously Marx went completely in the other direction and was extremely politically successful, even if the economics is complete nonsense. And the marginal revolution was essentially 3 different independently discovered corrections to everything that had preceded, but in particular Marx, because it was so egregious.
Whereas on the Keynesian side, the issue is more, this is somewhat to paraphrase the epic rap battle, that too much aggregation ignores human motivation or something like that. Those are the lyrics. So you're just aggregating, and by aggregating you think what you're doing is something clever. But you're also removing your ability to understand what it is that individual.
Keynesianism doesn't I mean, basically now, other than the couple of kind of recalcitrant Marxists that are still out there, nobody really objects to subjective value anymore. This is going a bit off topic. We might come back to it later, but the Keynesian sin as such is more exactly this point about aggregation. It's a we would say, I suppose, a misunderstanding at the macro level rather than this. This is very, what we're talking about previously is very much like foundations of micro.
Yes, you're right. So to restate that properly, it's not Keynesian economics, it's pre-marginalism. They had an objective view of value. Post-marginalism is subjective view. I love the destruction, the utter destruction of the labor theory of value. If you pay someone to dig a hole and fill it back in all day, like it takes a lot of labor, but you're quite literally creating nothing of value unless you just, I don't know if you just value working the person for no reason.
Do you remember the anecdote with Milton Friedman?
Oh yeah,
Do you know what I'm going to say? Which is unfortunate because he's a monetarist, so he's not quite, we like him, but we don't like him too much. But he has this great, he has this great anecdote which touches on not only the labor theory of value, but actually brings capital. I mean, it's more about capital. It is really, really good. It may be apocryphal, actually. I'm not sure if it really happened.
Probably,
but so he's visiting some building site, and the foreman is showing him around. And Friedman notices that there's not that much machinery, right? There's not that much capital, basically. A lot of people are using like shovels and hand tools rather than real heavy machinery. And he points this out to the foreman, and he's wondering if that's on purpose, and what is the reason for this? And the foreman says, "Oh yeah, well we had this hiring mandate." Right. So, we figured that we actually do have access to all this heavy machinery, but we could hire a lot more people if we just gave them shovels instead. And then Friedman comes back with, you could hire even more people again if you just gave them spoons.
Right. That's a really good one. So capital, another definition we've probably given, like this way of amplifying returns on human labor, right? Anything that's doing that. And then to, I guess, try to speak properly to the error in Keynesian economics is that it's trying to conceive of the world in economic aggregates, which I think, Sacha, to your point, like too much aggregation is it's a lower resolution depiction of reality, and lower resolution might not, it's erroneous, right? Like you can't say, oh, inflation up 4 points, unemployment down 3 points, like it's some kind of constant law, like water freezes at 0 degrees centigrade. Yet that's the sort of the mathematical approach they're trying to apply, whereas real economics is based on, methodological individualism, human action, etc.
And this is getting into quite a bit of detail we don't want to go into, but with Keynesianism is also one of the issues when you try and add math into it, and you bring in ISLM models and things like that, rather than, because if you do read some of the initial work from Keynes, a lot of it is based around the distinction between uncertainty and risk, which we do talk a lot about.
Yeah, we
have
actually
a lot of
quote
time
Keynes
for it.
favorably, just for the fun of it.
Keynes there because his argument would be that, so this is my steel manning of his position, would be that if you're in a really dire environment, economic environment, no one really knows what's happening. And so there is no more risk model that works. Everything becomes uncertain because you don't know what could happen. And so you need some entity to restore some sense of order, to say, hey, things are going to be fine. A bit like, imagine the troops are running away, and then the mighty general says, no, let's go forth and conquer. And you're bringing hope back into the troops, and the troops, okay, turn around, and they needed this. So this is the idea. I would say, I'm somewhat butchering it, but I think this is one of the more interesting takes, is that distinction between risk and uncertainty, and how you can, as a state, say, we are now in a highly uncertain environment, and it's our job to restore some sense of, go back to risk, and as in bring back conditions that people understand, bring back conditions where we can create trust between individuals, which is often what the state is quite good at doing. It creates, with rules and regulations, it essentially lets you know, hey, these are the rules of the game. So it's like returning people back on the pitch so that they can play the game that they understand. Now the issue is the issue of aggregation, and then there's also the whole issue of political capture. And Keynes would argue running a surplus is necessary when you're not in a recession. And when do you ever see that being done, right? So anyway, so I think there are a number of issues.
Yeah, but there is something I want to add.
We don't want.
Yeah, there's something I do want to add though, which is I'm glad we have actually got to this point, because I've considered bringing this up on Bitcoin podcast previously, but it never quite fit. But I think actually this conversational format is better for it, and it's somewhat heretical as well, which is that a lot of what is now called Keynesianism doesn't really come from Keynes. It actually comes from a guy called Paul Samuelson. And if anything, he's like the sneakiest of all, certainly in hindsight, because if it should just be called Samuelsonianism, basically, like all of the argumentation around introducing math, and more the I guess the philosophical or almost epistemological component of the certainty that can grant you in the moment, that completely comes from Samuelson. It's not to let Keynes off the hook entirely, because he suggested a lot of quite sort of stupid things, but they were a lot vaguer and a lot more philosophical and a lot less arrogantly put forward than is now the norm and is labeled Keynesianism. And actually, as Sacha was talking there, I remembered something. I'm sure people can find this very easily on YouTube. There's a legendary clip of Hayek being interviewed, and he says something like, Keynes is, he's clearly brilliant, but his biggest problem is he just doesn't understand economics, which I think is, I kind of vouch for that. I think that, that comes across in the way that we refer to him, at least.
Or that he's not well read in economics. I
think he then goes on to say that when the interviewer's like, wait, what are you talking about? Like, no, seriously, he just he didn't know, which is basically true. Yeah, he was not well read in economics, I suppose, but he didn't have a good grasp of all of the material he thought he was building on. Hence, he introduced a lot of quite silly ideas, but at a time when they politically took on a life of their own.
Yeah.
But it's Samuelson who you should really hate. And I think the reason that I get so kind of animated about it, although even though I've never said it before, but it is kind of fun to bring up, is that my real point here isn't that you should be nicer to Keynes. It's that you should be meaner to Samuelson, because he's really bad. He has a book, which I bought this book just because I felt like I had to read it, or I felt like I had to have it. I think it's just called Principles of Economic Analysis, I think. Something to that effect. We can put it in the show notes when we actually look it up. But it is like the worst influence on economics of, honestly, I think, of anything ever.
It's infamous textbook.
It's not the textbook. No, it's
No.
the textbook's just called economics because it's like everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the one Sacha Meyers, this is interesting too, actually. This is another good historical tidbit that, so he wrote this, his influence was absolutely enormous. This is why I think it's so odd that he's not, better known now and more hated now. In his day, he was easily the best known economist in the world, in a popular sense, which is even now is kind of weird to think. Like, I don't think there's maybe Paul Krugman, I don't know, but I don't think there's any economist who's like popularly known now. But he was like almost everybody would have at least been able to tell you who he was if they didn't know that much more about him. And he wrote this textbook, Economics, which is called Economics, which was, Keynesian and then Samuelsonian, even though that's not a word, and was the source, at least in terms of like the bedrock of economics education in the US. He was American. For the following, I don't know, it's been since then like 70 years, maybe 80 years by now. And the really funny thing about it was that in the introduction to this book, he predicted that the Soviet Union would soon overtake the US in terms of their, various, I don't know if it's GDP specifically.
I think it's
GDP.
Yeah.
So whatever measure of economic success. But he said by a certain date, and I forget what the first date he used was, but there were something like 13 or 14 editions of this textbook over 40 years. And every single edition in the introduction, that date was pushed back. And then it was finally taken out in the final edition of this book, which was in the mid-80s, I believe. He finally just stopped saying this. It was like 13 times of being wrong about this is enough. I've had enough.
Was it after the collapse? Is that when he took it out?
Good timing anyway, right? If that's what if that's the prediction you're aiming for, that I agree, that is a good time to stop predicting that in hindsight. So anyway, yes, people should hate Paul Samuelson more than they do.
Oh my God.
Was it taken out pre or post collapse of the USSR?
No, I think pre. I think it was taken out at the time.
Okay, lucky him.
One thing, just hate the sin, love the sinner. We're not saying, right? I'm not even saying hate anything. I'm going on this whole hate train here.
Yeah, it's all love. It's all love. If you are a business owner or manager, you should know these three numbers: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000 is the number of businesses that have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, which allows you to streamline accounting, financial management, human resources, and more. NetSuite turns 25 years old this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days rather than weeks, and to drive down cost. And finally, 1, because your business is one of a kind. So with NetSuite, you get a customized solution for all your key performance indicators in one efficient system with one source of truth. NetSuite is everything you need all in one place. Right now, you can download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist designed to give you consistently excellent performance absolutely free at netsuite.com/whatismoney. That's netsuite.com/whatismoney to get your free KPI checklist. Again, netsuite.com/whatismoney. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, iCoin Technology. iCoin has just released a sleek new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone, a little touch screen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, no GPS. It's a strictly physically cold hardware wallet. Like I said, it's got a high-res 3-inch touchscreen. It's got a camera for air gapping the wallet. It's got optional Bluetooth compatibility. And it's really a brand new UI, UX experience for a hardware wallet, making it very accessible, easy to use, not intimidating. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like iCoin Wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. Go to iCointechnology.com today and use promo code Bitcoin23 for 30% off of this new sleek hardware wallet. Okay, again, capital subjective, valuation is subjective, and I think this flows nicely into a central discussion in this chapter, which is culture, right? Culture has this subjectivity to it, obviously. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here to page 288, but I wanted to read this excerpt as well, which I thought was a beautiful definition of culture. You guys write, culture is a common frame of reference. It is a corpus of symbols used to communicate. Culture is language, or the sounds and images we attach to ideas. It is stories with their archetypes embodying the codes and mores of encouraged and reprimanded behavior. But it is equally how we respond to these ideas and behaviors. In consuming culture, we create it too. Culture is a web of metaphors, which we use to filter the raw information of the world into a distillation of the communal relevance of individual yet shared experience. Metaphors make connections which are not contained in the fabric of reality, but created by our own associative powers. Scruton argued. That was a quote from Scruton, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So, just like Hernando de Soto's physical capital, culture too is the product of our imagination. So my question here is like, what is, because we've talked a lot about capital, now we're talking about culture. What is the relationship between these two things? I mean, this is one of the most, when we start talking about Bitcoin fixes this, fixes that,
Yeah.
Makes people better, makes us more honest, all these things, it gets hard to describe why, right? It's like, well, how does fixing the money, quote unquote, fix the world or fix the culture, etc. So what if we're trying to like move into this discussion, a general open question, like what is the relationship between capital and culture, and how are they mutually influential?
So in that quote, you mentioned the word corpus.
Mm-hmm.
It is a corpus of symbols. And that speaks to accumulation. It speaks to putting things on top of each other, adding things over time.
Mm-hmm.
And we're back to the idea that you require time to accumulate capital and all these things. It's trial and error. It's learnings turning to stories to tell people that you have done something, learned something, and maybe you can't quite express it in a succinct way, but you can tell the story about it and people can feel what that conclusion is. And you then have these symbols accumulate and be communicated amongst people in that group. That turns into a body of work, which we can call a culture, the culture of a group. And it's the accumulated knowledge, experience, stories that people tell each other. It's clearly capital in the sense that it is of value to individuals who want to make things that they can then consume or that can ameliorate their lives. You read of it could be like such a simple thing as dictums, sayings from the past that remind you that you need to behave in a certain way, not behave in another way. And that those, and the reasons why, you might say, well, why should I do this? Why should I not steal or whatever? Well, because we've tried that. We've learned from these experiences, and that's our culture. So that's the way in which the learnings essentially make that group more productive, because it's it's just a sort of how-to guide based on experiences. What do you want to add to that?
Probably not much. Maybe one thing that came to mind just as you were speaking, though, is because I might not have set out to describe it that way, but I think experience and use the word experiment as well is a really important point. And I'm actually thinking back to one of the first things we talked about in the previous episode from our chapter 1, and when we were talking about MMA. But at that point, obviously, we were looking forward. We were saying we were keen to get all these concepts out there in this more accessible form because we anticipate them becoming both useful but consistent throughout analyses of different kinds of capital. And so I think the idea of experimentation, in that case, it was like, well, let's have these different fighting styles that have never been exposed to one another. And, there's no way of deducing the outcome. We have to just do it. That extrapolates really nicely. If anything, it's probably cleaner to trace that to culture than it's a bit messier in the case of economics, or maybe that's just me personally, I don't know, but that it's it helps communicate the value of not needing to discover everything from first principles, because and being appropriately, this is again some terminology we used a lot last time, very deliberately, being appropriately intellectually humble to acknowledge what learning has gone before you, such that you don't need to start from scratch. You can trust in some sense, maybe listen is even more important. You can acknowledge that you are part of a community that goes beyond just yourself, and the things that other people have learned via experimentation you can build on. I think that's a really interesting component to this.
Yeah, very interesting. And again, what came up for me there is when I first discovered Peterson's work, he had this quote or trope, you might say, is like, we all live inside stories. And when he first said that, I was like, what in the hell does that mean? Like, it's almost too obvious, doesn't make sense, almost like a tautology. Like, of course, everything is, if I'm talking to you about something in some ordered sequence of ideas or events, that's a story, right? But there's something deeper here, right? Where culture is like this, I don't know, a human social operating system, perhaps. It's like, here are the things we've learned over time. It's the, I don't know, ideological scaffolding or something that we almost don't even realize, like the moral intuitions we have, the way we act towards one another. There's this latent cultural programming that we just adopt by virtue of coming up in a certain time and place. And the word corpus, I'm glad you zeroed in on that one, because, that's what the Bible is, right? To pick out one religious text, it's a corpus, right? It's a library of books and stories we've accumulated over time. And from that flow, again, certain morals of these stories or moral intuitions. And we talked about this, I think, in the first episode, that perhaps those stories fuel liberal ideology, right? That underpins capitalism to some extent, that you need this understanding of, well, let's not steal from each other. Let's honor the sovereignty of the individual, et cetera, to kind of get capitalism even going in the first place. So maybe, and what's the quote about standing on the shoulders of giants? Like, we can see further because we stand on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
Like, culture is something like that. It's letting us stand on the shoulders of these proverbial giants that have come before us, so that we don't have to start from scratch. So my question or point of conversation here, like, is religion or religious stories or mythology more generally, is that a form of capital? Like, it's something that's letting us not start from scratch. It's a term we keep using. Is that a form of capital? And if so, like, to what extent? There are some people that think, religion is something we can just dispense with. It's this old primitive storytelling, whatever. Now we're in the scientific age. We don't need it. Can we? Like, it seems like we do need something. We need some type of story or mythology or cultural fabric to inhabit. So is it capital? And then if so, to what extent is it important for capitalism?
So I definitely think it's capital. It goes into the feeding of human capital. We were discussing in one of the previous episodes, the Protestant work ethic. You can think of that as an operating system, as a set of things to do and things not to do. And they were incredibly successful ideas to believe in. They, in that sense, they are true. In the very practical sense of, these ideas that come from generations of experimentation were distilled into stories, reveal something that is simply true, that is objectively true, that is out there, that is beyond us.
Like the division of labor. Like, you discover the division of labor in a way through these stories, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. You discover ideas, you discover things, you understand, and you go and try them. First, you have an hypothesis. Oh, maybe this. And it turns out that whenever you apply this idea or this learning from that story, something good comes out of it. That is truth in a way.
Can I tweak that just slightly? I think it's when everyone applies it. it's far more powerful when it's
when everyone
when
applies
it's when it's not just one person's behavior, when it's it's reciprocal and reflexive. Even you're behaving in a certain way in large part because you expect others to behave that way.
Yes. Well, that gets to that gets to more pragmatic, as in I'm not stealing because I don't want people stealing from me. That's
that's not.
I think
it's more like I don't want. I'm not stealing, and also I'm going to stop other people stealing.
I'm going to stop other people stealing.
I hold others to the same standard because the point of this is communal.
Yeah, I'm going even further, and perhaps that's further than you'd like to go, in saying that it's objectively true. That's
I think that's. I agree with that too.
And I ground that in religion. As in
Yeah.
something that is beyond the human experience, and that it's not just relative to our own point of view. It is objective, but that's completely different discussion. And it gets down the root of religion and things like that. It's kind of off topic.
The point about it being objectively true, I think, is really interesting. Actually, I don't disagree with that at all. I quite strongly agree with it, and I think there's a really interesting framing you can give it, which we haven't really talked about in our discussion yet, Robert, but is in the book in quite a few places, which is, it goes back to, we did mention this last time, about different ways of knowing, right? And again, right back to the chapter 1 in MMA and being appropriately intellectually humble and being mindful of what you can and can't know and how you attain that knowledge in the first place. And so a concept that I'm pretty sure we bring this up in chapter 1, because we know how important it is and how many times we want to come back to it, is something that we're primarily quoting James Scott when we say it, but it's to be completely clear, it's not his idea. He is quoting a handful of ancient Greek philosophers, but he's using it in a really interesting way that we borrow, and it's this term metis. And it basically, it's tricky because he finds it so interesting in the first place because it doesn't have a perfect translation into English. It's actually, now I think about it, it's kind of like the ambiguity around free, it's freeze and freedom, freeze and beer. It's different ways of conceiving of knowledge. And his argument, we maybe could go into this actually, because it is right through the book. It's very much on purpose. I think probably James Scott.
I do have some definitions that I, sorry to interrupt, but that I pulled out on metis from the book. We didn't talk about it last time, I don't think, but being rules of thumb or heuristics, the ability or the experience necessary to influence an outcome. Yeah. But it resists simplification into, rigid principles, right? You can't just perfectly codify it. It's maybe something like wisdom, perhaps, right? It's hard.
I think wisdom is a decent translation. I think the one that I was leading up to, though, which again isn't perfect, it's like a good way of thinking about this, is distinguishing between knowing that and knowing how. So metis is knowing how, and or maybe you could tweak it slightly. Knowing what to do, not knowing that something is true in some maybe more platonic sense almost, but knowing in a situation, probably like a social situation, to tie in with this, what should you do? Not normatively, not what is ethical, but in order to achieve a certain outcome, which probably is ethical to be frank, but in order to achieve a certain outcome, what should you do that will probably or definitely achieve that? And so I think with that reading of knowledge and how you can know things and how you can come to attain that knowledge, what Sacha was describing actually is true. I don't think that's objectionable at all. If anything, I think it's interesting that it might seem alien to people because, and this is exactly Scott's complaint, this is why he introduces this term in the first place, we've got to a point where, this is true even when he wrote it probably 30 years ago or so, we give so much credence to knowing that and platonic facts and propositions and so on, as a culture, that we, as a consequence of that, I think probably not so much, rarely deliberately, but nonetheless completely downplay knowledge how. And so when Sacha described this as like, this is true, I completely agree. It is true. It sounds, probably to some people sounds weird, but I don't think it should.
Yeah, there's I'm reminded of John Vervaeke, who I've had on the show. He distinguishes, there's 4 P's of knowledge, but 2 of them are propositional, which is knowing that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's procedural, which is knowing how, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I agree. It is, I would argue, objectively true that stealing is detrimental to productivity, somewhat intuitively, right? If you consider everyone in the world is spending their hours doing something, every hour that's spent stealing is spent not producing. So obviously productivity go down. And further, when you steal from people, you're disincentivizing them to produce, because if I'm going to produce something and you're going to steal it, then why should I even produce in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And so what it's interesting because you get, it's hard to talk about. You have this like mythological form of capital, story capital, I don't know, narrative capital, human operating system, whatever, that actually lends itself to the creation of more physical, traditional forms of capital, right? We get new inventions and innovations and all of that. But then that sort of has a feedback on our stories, on our cultural development. So that, I guess that's what I'm trying to tease out, is like, what is that feedback loop between this narrative form of capital and then like more physical, traditional forms of capital? And the extension to that question is like, I'm trying to get to ultimately is like, well, what is Bitcoin really going to do to culture? Right? Like it's a new, again, we touched on it last time. It's a technology, but it's also maybe an ideology, sort of, because you need people to agree to it for it to work, to exist. Or the more people that agree to it, the more it succeeds, the more it monetizes. So I'm just trying to, and these things are very tricky to talk about, like how does that feedback loop work? And then what does Bitcoin do to culture?
These are big questions.
Yeah.
I can't think of a simple answer. The feedback one's super interesting. I see exactly what you mean. I'm not sure that we really talk about that though.
No.
Which is why I don't think I have a very good answer to it. Is anything on the mind for you?
No, not on that specific point.
I could just thinking out loud, like, okay, objectively true that stealing reduces productivity. Also objectively true that I guess the great promise of Bitcoin is that it would make stealing more expensive or more difficult, more risky.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of lending itself to a more productive society, which would be one which accumulates more capital over time.
Mm.
And so I
think the Bitcoin one's a bit easier to answer, probably because I think the reason we're struggling with the first one is it's almost too general. Like Bitcoin is a specific example of why there might be this relationship. I think you have to be careful with being too simplistic and too reductive about that relationship, because my conception of how Bitcoin affects culture, I think, involves quite a few steps. It's not like, oh, we have Bitcoin and then, everybody just becomes more moral or whatever. I know you're not suggesting that. I think it's important to kind of get that out of the way. And actually, I think the especially tricky thing, and this is maybe a reason why it's difficult for people to understand if they haven't started to experience it themselves, is that if anything, it's that the incentive structure provided by fiat is bad. It's not so much that the incentive structure provided by Bitcoin is good. It's that it's almost like there's like a this is water phenomenon almost with people who haven't yet wrapped their heads around Bitcoin, that they don't know anything other than fiat. So they can't see how bad it is or in what ways it is bad in the first place. And I mean, I'm sure some people will disagree with this, but my conception of the impact of Bitcoin isn't even that Bitcoin is itself good. It's just that it undoes the bad of fiat. And so it really is very difficult to even start to explain to someone who doesn't kind of already get it, because it's not even clear what about Bitcoin you're supposed to point to. I mean, this has always been my approach, is actually just start to unravel how fiat corrupts culture and corrupts incentives and so on. We talked about some of this last time. I find that much easier to do than to say how Bitcoin is, fixes it or is good for it. I don't know if you have an easier, like a cleaner way.
Don't know if it's a cleaner way. I've got a different framing for it, which is that it's much harder, or if not impossible, to lie under a Bitcoin standard. So and by lie, I don't mean tell a lie, I mean lie on the money network. Because in a fiat system, we were discussing this again, previous episode, you can go and essentially just say, as a government, I will now activate God mode. And laws of economics be damned, I am now suspending everything and I will now interfere.
Right.
If things do not satisfy my agenda, I'm going to simply tweak prices. I can change the price of capital. I can increase the amount of money supply that's out there. I can start tweaking things. And all of these things, they're manipulations, and they're essentially trying to send signals to get participants on the network to behave in a certain way. And those messages in some ways are lies, in the sense that they're not messages coming from participants of the network acting in a specific way, saying, oh, hey, by the way, I'm not going to take that loan because the interest rate right now is too high. And guess what happens if you do that? If enough people do that, the interest rate simply comes down. If more businesses want to lend, there's increased leverage. Maybe at that point rates go up because of there's higher demand, there's more risk for the incremental lender not being as high. So like all these things, they're realities of individuals communicating with the money network. They're not lying. They're literally telling you, hey, this is my situation. I am willing to trade X for Y. This is how things are happening. So you can't lie. And if you do lie, there's the money consequence and the monetary consequence. We talked about this. Imagine being coming in with an arbitrage idea and you're wrong. So you're not really lying, but you're wrong. You're going to be hurt financially. And if you're coming in with a lie, you're also going to be hurt because the network cannot be corrupted in a way. And so if you can't lie on the money network, well, you can't as easily lie either when you are doing other things. And that's forcing everyone to be more honest with each other. So back to the discussion we were having with Keynes. Keynesianism under a gold standard would be quite interesting and very different from Keynesianism under
Samuelsonianism.
Under a fiat standard. Because if it's under a gold standard, go back to the initial thing I was saying about Keynes essentially trying to go back from uncertainty to risk by providing confidence. The only thing you could do is you store gold or you store whatever hard asset you have, and you start spending that.
Yeah.
Okay. If you run out of it, the only thing you can do is tax it, directly, openly tax your population, or steal, but openly, again, people will see it. People see that you're not just surreptitiously printing more money and nobody can see that that's what you're doing, and you're kind of behind the scenes doing all of this nobody really understands what's happening, and it's a lie in essence, because you're introducing signals in the marketplace that have nothing to do with participants.
Right.
You want to create this idea that you should stop lending right now, or that you should start lending right now, without having done any interactions in the marketplace for that. So like, if you think of that, you're removing lies. And just by forcing that, you're forcing people to be honest. And just the political discourse becomes way more honest, because if you're going to do Keynesianism under a gold standard or under a Bitcoin standard, you're going to have to tax, have a reserve, which you will spend in bad times. And people will very quickly realize whether or not it's a good idea to do that, much more quickly than if you are under a fiat standard where you can just put it under the rug. So that's one thing. I think not lying at the core of the network, tons of value. And then that feeds into society, because, hey, the way you're going to interact in the marketplace, or the way you interact with politicians and the way they influence your decisions on a day-to-day basis is going to feed into tons of other stuff. Yeah. So I know it's a few steps removed and it's not super clean, and it's not like Bitcoin, then culture's great, and look at that.
Right,
We're building Parthenons again, and everything's wonderful. It's not that simple. But you're clearly providing a system that has fewer bad incentives, and so you could hope that over time people have better outcomes. That would be my way of framing it.
Yeah, I've thought of a way of linking this more clearly to culture, but it's perfect because it builds on exactly what you've just said. There's two observations I'd make to set this up. So one, I'm actually just going to read a tiny bit of the same quote, Robert, which is that in consuming culture, we create it too. So to tease that out just a little bit, I think it's really important to see culture, actually, again, to refer back to the previous episode and previous discussion, to see culture as dynamic rather than static, right? Culture is not just to make the point, it's not like a list of rules. It's not something you read and you're like, okay, that's my culture, that's how I'll behave. It's something that you learn by behaving in it and that your behavior also contributes to. So culture is always evolving based on the behavior of the people in the culture, which might sound it sounds self-referential because it's you can't understand it without that self-referential component. So that's point number one. Point number two, though, is building directly on what Sacha's mentioned, that when you think about what these lies in the economic network are, they're not random. They're not just, changing bits of information here and there. For essentially, I think, political reasons, they're always of roughly the same sort, which is pushing out the consequences, presumably negative consequences, of current positive gains, basically. And I guess another way of framing that, it's not describing exactly the same thing, but it is similar, which is just consuming rather than producing, right? So deferring as much as is even physically possible the production of what we want to consume, or actually to refer to a part of the book we haven't discussed yet, in chapter 5, the capital strip mine, just chipping away at the stock of capital. So consuming the capital rather than consuming the flows that the capital throws off, which obviously you can do in the moment, but the obvious analogy there is, which we say multiple times afterwards, the farmer just eating the seeds rather than planting. You can always eat seeds, but eventually you run out and then you have nothing. Then you can't consume. You can't consume at all. So I think the way you combine these two is really interesting. And this, I think, actually finally directly answers the question, or at least attempts to answer the question in terms of what the impact is on culture. That if these lies are encouraging people to act as if they don't need to produce before they consume, as if they don't need to pay back their debt, as if they basically, Sacha touched on this too, that essentially can just lie themselves and there are no consequences because we've artificially deferred the consequences. When you feed that back into point number one, that will influence how everybody else behaves on a long enough time horizon, because culture is necessarily self-referential. If you can get away with lying, you deteriorate the collective ability of basically everybody else to stop you from lying. And one by one, they'll all start lying instead. So that's Bitcoin fixes this. Hooray.
No, it's so fascinating. And I'm just reminded, so you're saying culture, we're consuming culture, obviously we're plugged into it, but at the same time that we're participating in it, we're also producing it.
Yeah.
Sort of like language, right? We're all using language all the time, but there's, again, new words pop up, new memes, new phrases, whatever it may be. And it's interesting too that maybe the connection here, you notice language changing based on technology changing, right? You get new phrases. The one I always like to point to is that's a feature, not a bug, right? We say that about a lot of things now that aren't software, but that's a phrase we got from the software paradigm that wouldn't make sense 30 years ago. No one would know what you were saying if you said that. And so it's almost like with new, and you said it in here too, culture is this collection of metaphors. With new technologies, we get new metaphors, and then those new metaphors get extended to other domains of meaning, right? So the tech is changing the culture, and then the culture is changing the tech, and it's like, kind of like back and forth, back and forth. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, CrowdHealth. CrowdHealth is a Bitcoin-enabled alternative to legacy health insurance. Now let's face it, legacy health insurance is an absolute scam. Nobody can explain this better than the legendary comedian Chris Rock.
Insurance. You got to have some insurance. You got to. There's an insurance. They shouldn't even call it insurance. They should just call it in case shit. Like, I give a company some money in case shit happens. Now, if shit don't happen, shouldn't I get my money back?
So with CrowdHealth, instead of just paying premiums that you'll never see again, you can hold part of this pool of savings in dollars and in Bitcoin through CrowdHealth. And when you have a health event, you can draw against this pool of communal savings. So go to joincrowdhealth.com/breedlove to learn more or sign up. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Wasabi Wallet. With Wasabi Wallet, you can receive, send, and store Bitcoin privately. In Wasabi Wallet, your transaction history and wallet balance are completely hidden. Wasabi Wallet is easy to use. All of its privacy features are built in by default, and it works with any amount of Bitcoin. Wasabi users can make CoinJoin transactions together with BTC Pay server users or Trezor Suite users. For BTC Pay server users, they can make payments directly inside of a CoinJoin, and for Trezor Suite users, you can make CoinJoins directly on a hardware wallet. These features result in fee savings and security improvements for both sets of users. So go to wasabiwallet.io today to download the state-of-the-art Bitcoin privacy wallet. And so I want to ask that, all right, this might be a stretch, but it's just something I've thought about. Ethics, if we define ethics, and please correct me if you have a different definition for this, but something simply is like a code of behavior, generally accepted code of behavior. Mm-hmm. You know, general expectations for behavior, let's say, or action. You know, we talked about religion. We've always had these stories that kind of guide us ethically, like, oh, it's bad to steal, it's good to love thy neighbor, whatever the thing is. But we've never had a system of ethics that is, like, I don't think, plugged into economic incentives. It's like, I don't know if you'd say Bitcoin is a system of ethics necessarily. It's not saying do not steal, but it's sort of making stealing or lying less productive or fruitful for the individual that does it. So is that like, can we conceive of Bitcoin as a system of ethics energized by economic incentives somehow? And is that part of its novelty?
So the way I would frame it, I'd be interested in seeing if you agree with that, because that's not really something we touch on. But I think that what you start with are these objective truths about humans, about morality, and then you find tools that are true in the sense that they are in accordance with these fundamental objective truths. So the reason why Bitcoin is true, if we want to use that word, is because it understands the reality of human ethics. And it is shaped in accordance with those human ethics. And so if it had a different shape and we were who we were, it simply wouldn't work. And so it's not so much that itself is ethical, it just maps onto what is actually ethical. We were discussing, like, don't lie. Here's a system where it's very difficult to lie, therefore it maps onto that, and it respects the individual, right? Man is made in the image of God, therefore there is sovereignty in the person. You need to respect them for who they are. All these things, they shouldn't be means to your ends, but they should be ends in themselves, like all that. And that's what you're essentially reinforcing with that structure. So it works because it's true. And that truth itself is fundamentally grounded in something way deeper. That's the bedrock. And it just matches.
It's also maybe an interesting angle on that too, is how intentional all of it was. And I want to preempt myself a little bit because I do get a bit wary of arguments about, what did Satoshi really mean kind of thing. But I think there are some things he clearly meant that aren't really in dispute. Like the headline from the Times article that's in the Genesis blog. That's a pretty clear message, not just as to his intentions, but also the context of those intentions that make it all undeniable, I think. It's not just that, not that anybody I think would make this argument anyway, but it's not just that we kind of stumbled into this and like, oh wow, that turns out this works really well as money. Who knew? It was extremely deliberately conceived to be maybe not perfect money, but the best that we have had. Or it was conceived in contrast to bad money.
And back to the culture point and capital accumulation, it is standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
So from a technical perspective, clearly you needed to overcome a number of hurdles to get there. But then also from understanding the structure you would want to set up in the first place, that takes hundreds of years, thousands of years of economies working out and looking at what worked, what didn't work, and writing things. And there's tons and tons and tons of books and hours of thinking that go into inspiring someone to then think that this is perhaps the answer. And then we take that on and say, oh, I like that.
Right.
Let's try and apply it and see if it maps onto the reality of human behavior. And if it does map onto onto who we are truly, if it therefore is true, it will grow as a network because it simply maps onto reality. And so it's true because it works. It works because it's true.
Right.
And that's where it goes. And so it's capital at that point. Like Bitcoin could be capital if it is useful, or if Charlie Munger is right, it's nothing.
Right. Right. Yes.
It's gibberish.
Yeah.
From his perspective, it's not capital; it's just useless.
Yes.
So again, very subjective, but
I think
it will prove itself out through experimentation.
Right, and it's the usefulness or the pragmatic truthfulness of it is proven in people using it. Right, if it works to achieve a certain purpose, then that. I think you use the term in the book somewhere, a vast laboratory of trial and error. Right, that we've
is that's a quote from someone though, right? Is it Jacobs?
Yes, probably. Is it? I
think it's Jane Jacobs.
It does sound.
I think it's in the urban section.
Yeah.
And so Fiat is like breaking this natural ethical code of do not steal, right? Because once you get into a fiat paradigm, you're printing money, right? You're stealing, again, in a surreptitious way. And so this is more of like just a philosophical, rhetorical flourish, perhaps, but I love this quote that human nature is like water. It takes the shape of its container. It's almost like we're just pouring human nature out of the fiat container into the Bitcoin container. And in the fiat container, we are incentivized to treat people as means to an end, right? If you're printing money to steal from a population, you're not treating those people as rational, independent, ends in themselves. You're treating them as a means to your own enrichment as a central bank shareholder or bureaucrat or whatever. But in the Bitcoin paradigm, it's actually incenting us to treat one another as ends in ourselves, because the stealing, to treat people as a means of stealing from them through printing money or fiat legislation, let's say, is just less doable. So somehow there's this like ethical shift occurring as a result of a technological shift.
Yeah. I have a response to that, but you find the immense laboratory bit? Is there something you want to mention?
No, there's nothing really. Looking for a quote.
Oh, yes. It's actually found in the book where it's an immense laboratory of trial and error. What was it I was going to say? Oh, sorry, I just completely forgotten what I wanted to bring up.
Or maybe there's this one at the very beginning. This is a quote from a book about Robert Moses, who was a urban planner in New York. So it's a book it's a quote about him, right? It's not from him, but so it says, yeah, you can draw any kind of picture you want on a clean slate and indulge your every whim in the wilderness in laying out a New Delhi, Canberra, or Brasilia. But when you operate in an overbuilt metropolis, you have to hack your way with a meat axe. And it's because he's drawing, he's planning highways through New York and things like that. And it's just this idea that, you know, he comes in and he's like, we're gonna have to hack our way with a meat axe. And that's how I think about the Fed interacting or interfering in the marketplace. They're like, yeah, this is too messy, and we're gonna need a clear highway running through this, because that's where we want to get to. And it's kind of just using whoever's participating in that network as an end to their means. As a means to their end. Yeah, I got it mixed up there. Rather than respecting individuals who live there and be like, oh, I'm challenging a community. Do we work with that community in shaping the future of that city, or do we simply just completely annihilate entire neighborhoods because we think it's of value to the society, but we've not really asked them because, right. Hey, why should we? We are the planners. Surely we know better. We have studied this stuff, right? Right? So because we went to university, do we really need to listen to people who are living there?
Yes.
Yeah. I remember what I wanted to say, which is just making a couple of links between different points that we've brought up, and it's on this question of, okay, if we have a Bitcoin standard, you know, how are people incentivized to behave, and how does that affect culture? The first thing to pick up on, again, was my point, which I'm not insisting that this is the way other people have to think about it, but it just is the way I think about it, that it's really just undoing all the bad of fiat. It's not necessarily that good in and of itself, but one of the aspects of the harm of fiat that I mentioned before is just setting things up such that what would naturally be negative feedback is postponed. And so a minute ago I mentioned, okay, well, that feeds pretty directly into the culture. There's another element of that, though, which is that they're postponed, but not indefinitely, right? The consequences do happen eventually, and people do suffer eventually. And actually, one link here to culture, but again, it's more in the fiat as negative sort of lens, is that there are, and so this is the other point I wanted to, this is what I was forgetting before. You were asking about cultural frameworks that tie directly to economic incentives. I think there are, I don't think it's like a major focus of really any culture that I'm aware of, but there are nonetheless, cultural dictums, let's say, or received norms around economic activity, maybe even more on a personal level, around the not just the utility of saving, but I guess that there's an ethical component too, right? That if you are a good person, you should save. And I would argue, again, this is like a pragmatic truth. It is good to save, in particular, because when there's, this is how you unravel where the truth even comes from, that when something goes bad, and inevitably things will eventually go bad. So this is now maybe even bringing in some of what Sacha was mentioning about Robert Moses and central planning in general. It's kind of relies on the assumption that nothing is ever going to go wrong because you've just figured it all out. But the received wisdom is, okay, eventually something is going to go wrong. If you have savings, you can deal with it, right? And you're not pushing that cost on others. You're not externalizing, or you're not socializing the cost, even though you've already privatized all of the benefits. And so I think that's a really important way of linking it in with culture, that if you can't set up the circumstances where that can even happen in the first place, that cultural norm won't have been chipped away at. So basically, we'll go back to, it is wise, prudent, even good to save. And every now and then something will go wrong, but people will be able to deal with it. Rather than everybody seemingly thinking, why basically ever save when you can always borrow, and just accumulating more and more, well, debt, literally in the financial sense, but almost more ominously, like, in the sense of eventually something is going to go horribly wrong, and then basically nobody can deal with it, because not only because we don't have the money, but I think more importantly because we don't have the culture at that point either.
Yeah. And the capital, right? Like,
capital
is getting consumed in the process too. It's just it is so fascinating. And the key link, I don't know, this word incentives, we throw it around a lot, but it's like, how do you really get in? Like, what does that really mean? There's this, I heard that, I don't remember where I heard this. So someone said, eat first, then ethics.
Yeah.
It's like almost like ethics are a bit of a luxury in a way that we create for ourselves through capital accumulation. Like if you're in a pure caveman environment, like your ethics are basically,
well, we remember
zero capital world. It's like your ethics are useless.
We touched on this last time, and I think it links very nicely with what I just mentioned, that, if you make people, I think this is exactly what I said, if you make people desperate, which, to tie into what I said a minute ago, you will do eventually if you keep postponing the negative feedback. If you force it to all come at once when no one has any savings and no one has any ethics,
right?
Eventually it'll get really ugly and people will get really desperate. But regardless of how it comes about, if people are desperate, they just will be selfish. It's and the kind of commentary I gave on that last time is that it's not. I don't think that claim is in any way deterministic. I think it's just common sense, right? And I think the context that time was, we were talking about what is even sensible to expect from people in terms of like how you create incentives in the first place. And I think this is a very clear one that I like the quote, basically, is where I'm going with this. That you do need to. You need to eat. You need to just not be desperate in the first place. And then I said where it came from last time was more obviously that requires a base of capital in order to get to that point. But I think the ethical point is maybe more fundamental than the economics that support it.
Yeah. So with that quote, I think it's true that that's how you will behave. I don't know that that's how you ought to behave.
Yes.
In that, yes, when there is no food on the table, you're going back to, I don't care about ethics. Let me just be ruthless and get whatever I need to get.
Yeah.
But if you have that attitude, the issue is it's harder to escape that situation.
Right. Chicken and the egg kind of thing.
And if you think of the very early mythological stories, they're all about often sacrifice, right? Yeah. And the sacrifice, killing the lamb, whatever, it is about, hey, I will give something now to get something in the future.
Right.
Abel and Cain, it just starts like that. God's like, all right, come and give me your offerings. Come and give me something. You're going to get something back in return. It starts there. That's some of the early biblical stories. And you need to have that mindset, but it's so much easier to be like, why would I do that? Why would I even put something aside? I'm just going to consume it. I'm hungry. And well, because that's the start of the treadmill. That's how you start that process. And it's so hard to see it when you've never gone through that process many times and you've not seen generations of improving life qualities, of improving standards of quality of life, because how do you know that it's going to work?
Yes. Right.
So
if not for culture.
And culture is the story that keeps reiterating that point. Like, please do this. Please do put things aside. Please take some of what you are making and donate it, in essence, to the future. Some things will come back to you, and it will be a plenty.
I think actually an equally interesting framing is exactly the other way around. So it's imagining this disintegrating. Yeah. Right. And so this whole point of, okay, if you're hungry, if you're if you're really suffering in whatever way, you're just going to be selfish. You're just, maybe you shouldn't be, but it's likely that you're at least relatively going to be more selfish, and you're going to care less about other people. That's you mentioned this briefly yourself, Robert. What gave me this idea that there is kind of a chicken and egg element to this, because that setup, I think, is a really fascinating way to appreciate not only capital, consumption of capital, but also making it more intangible than just the cliche of the farmer with the seed, but also more, in a weird way, more realistic, more appropriately appreciating the tragedy of it, and linking it to culture as well. Because if you're being selfish, if you're if you're really struggling and you can't afford to think about other people, the obvious immediate consequence of that is that you're unable to create that social capital. Because again, social capital is, and we argue, I think we're quite explicit about this in a couple of places, social capital is the precondition to forming any kind of capital, because it requires cooperation. It's this, people have to disagree, but nonetheless cooperate, and they're not the same, but they're not forced to all be different either. There has to be a happy medium. And the poverty and desperation and hunger is, admittedly, it's an extreme, but when you're in that situation, you can't create the social capital that is necessary to create the economic capital that is necessary to give you food to get out of the situation. And so actually thinking about how this can unwind and get very ugly very quickly, and also why, back to your point and your question, Robert, why culture is completely intrinsic to this. I think that's really interesting as well.
It's mind-blowing, really, because I started to think of mythology as social capital, like the original social capital, definitely. Right? And it's, I guess, I mean, obviously it teaches us many things, but one of the most important things is this: how can we negotiate with the future, right? The very basic biblical notion of sowing before reaping, right? And so there has to be that catalyst point. It seems like the storytelling or the mythology, whatever, is that beginning of social capital that leads to the accumulation of more traditional capital. And so, yeah, it's amazing. It's like, do not lie, do not steal starts to create this flywheel effect towards civilization.
Yeah.
And to your point earlier too, like, do not lie, do not steal is also, people are incentivized to save in that environment. And savings gives us anti-fragility. When the bad things do happen, well, we have savings. Right. Whereas on the fiat standard, you just invert the whole thing. It's like, consume.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. I've kept you guys too long as it is, but that I couldn't interrupt that last part of the discussion. The rest of this chapter is equally mind-blowing. I have a million more things to talk about, but I think we can call it a day for today. I, again, really appreciate you guys doing this. I appreciate you going down these deep philosophical rabbit holes with me, because I'm always wrestling with these things in my mind. So I like to be in good company to talk about them. Where can people find you guys on the internet?
Have you figured out where people can find you yet? That was your homework from last time. Yeah, for me, Twitter is the easiest. It's just ALLENF32.
Yeah, for me, it's Sacha_Meyers. Sacha's SACHA, Meyers MEYERS. But I don't tweet very often, or zeet very often.
Oh yeah, sorry. The website formerly known as Twitter.
Oh yeah, X post, right? We'll put that in the show notes, and I look forward to the next discussion, guys. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the time.